Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd actually like to follow up on some of your questions about the respective roles of NORAD, Northern Command, the Defense Department generally vis-a-vis law enforcement. As Commissioner Benvenisti adverted to when I was at the Justice Department and we were planning for the Atlanta Olympics, we rehearsed a number of scenarios with the Defense Department and the various components thereof who were responsible for providing support to the Olympics. And when we got to the scenario of a domestic hijacking of a plane headed into a stadium, and I asked what they thought the proper division of labor should be, I was told, and it won't come as any surprise to you, General Arnold, given your testimony, that this is a law enforcement matter and that the armed services would provide technical support to the FBI to shoot the aircraft down. And my response, of course, was, that's preposterous. And in fact, General Arnold, I am glad to see that and hear that when faced with the judgment of whether you should do your job in defending the United States or wait for someone from the FBI to call you, you decided to get the authority later, because that is the only rational response. Probably could have gotten you court-martialed, but one appreciates that sort of leadership. I say this because it is clear that before September 11th, we know that the Defense Department discussed for decades what the appropriate role of our military should be in defending the domestic United States. This was not a new question. It was discussed up and down and across, and I see General McKinley nodding. Anyone who has been in the service for the period of time that you gentlemen have been know that. And clearly, September 11th served, if anything else, if nothing else, to break the resistance that had occurred to having a different view of what the appropriate role of the military should be. So with that, with that background, I would like to just be very clear as to what has changed and what has not. As I understand it, the requirement of prior law enforcement request has been eliminated. Is that correct?
We are able, under Operation Noble Eagle, which we are under presently, to respond to an event as a military entity, to be in position to support. We don't, as you said eloquently, we don't have time to wait anymore to launch our fighters. So we have to take proactive action to do that.
Thank you for that. And second of all, your radars are now, as you put it, are pointed inward as well. Is that correct?
We have incorporated the radars that were there all along so that our military controllers can now see them, see those tracks of interest.
Now, you remain reliant to a certain extent on the efficacy of the FAA's radar system, as Secretary Lehman pointed out. Are you completely comfortable that they are more than adequate to your mission?
Ma'am, you're absolutely right. We are dependent upon the FAA. We are working closely with them and their programmers because there are some financial disconnects. The FAA looks at radar differently than the military does. They are optimizing their radar to control traffic for commerce. We, the military, need to see very specific data, which the FAA doesn't need. It costs money to do that. Our programmers, along with the FAA, have identified some disconnects in programmatics. And senior leadership is aware of those disconnects. We want to make sure the radars last so that this mission can be done properly and effectively.
I would ask you to supply for the record, if you could, a statement of what would be necessary in the professional opinion of you and your colleagues to bring the FAA system, upon which you are now reliant, up to the standards that you think are required to defend the domestic United States.
Yes, ma'am.
The other issue which you've raised in your testimony is that of communication between the FAA and NORAD, or lack thereof. And one of the questions that came immediately to mind is why you would not be co-located with FAA so that there is no such communication issue. Are you now co-located with FAA and have a presence in its command center that opens up when there is an emergency?
Ma'am, we've done a little of both. We after General Arnold had this tragedy occur on the 11th, the FAA provided us with liaisons at all our air defense sectors and our continental NORAD region and at NORAD. So we have real-time people that we can turn to and say, please use your communications channels so that we can get information. In addition, the National Capital Region has stood up a coordination center at Herndon, Virginia, in the FAA building, where we have military personnel, members of Transportation Security, Secret Service, and other federal agencies where they can coordinate the efforts in this area. So that has helped us tremendously, and we think we can continue to do that.
Thank you for that answer. And finally, in my list, are you comfortable that you now have the pre-placement of your resources in terms of aircraft, et cetera, where they need to be to adequately defend our critical infrastructure in the United States?
Yes, ma'am. I believe at the present time we have an adequate force structure to do that. The requirements change daily, weekly, based on the event. For example, if a space shuttle were to take off, we'd want to have aircraft at the Cape. So whenever we have a security event, the Olympics, the State of the Union, we move our fighters around in a flexible manner to respond to that. So we do have the capability based on intelligence and real-world need to do that.
We may want to follow up in closed session on that issue. As the charter for NORAD and the existence of Northern Command were being changed and created, there clearly would have been debate within the Pentagon over what the scope of that charter should be. And I speak as someone who served there twice, and I can imagine what some of those discussions might have been. What authorities were contemplated to be given to Northern Command that haven't been? And what authorities, if you were writing that charter on your own, would you give it?
Well, ma'am, I don't mean to dodge the question, but I don't know if I have the level of knowledge that you require for that answer. I will tell you, as a component commander who needs to employ resources in defense of United States citizens, I will tell you that the binational arrangement with Canada that NORAD has had for over 40 years has worked exceptionally well for the threat period that we went through, the Cold War, and subsequently. The stand-up of Northern Command has given us the ability to now tailor our forces and to work with local law enforcement so that we can respond to a critical need far more quickly, and we do it in a joint fashion with Navy, Marine Corps, Army, our Guardsmen, our Reservists, and our United States Air Force. So the Northern Command framework, as I see it, and we're still in initial operating capability, will become fully operational capable when General Abarch says that they are. We are learning, we are training together and exercising together, and from my perspective, working exceedingly well.
And one final question, General Arnold. We get some of our most candid advice from people who have taken their uniform off. And I use that phrase as well for civilians who no longer play whatever role they happen to have played. Having lived through the searing moments of 9/11, and having had the awesome responsibilities that you had on that day, and having had limited resources as you had in that day, legal and physical, to help prevent harm, what advice do you have for us about changes that we should make as a country?
Well, I wrote a paper. No, I didn't write a paper on that, but I think one would have to. That is probably where you're going to go. We're very fortunate that we have a country with so many resources. And let me point out, if I could, while you might there could be criticism of what we did in response. It worked pretty well in terms of the after-action reports. Airplanes were getting airborne because people knew they had to get airborne. And I don't have the timelines for all of these things, but as the president told the military to prepare to defend the country, we started gathering up all the aircraft that traditionally had not supported NORAD. And as soon as we could get armament to them, we either put them on orbit. As you recall, we were on orbit for some time throughout the country. The Navy responded magnificently as well. It was in the press. I had Admiral Dawson, Vice Admiral Dawson, called me. He was on the George Washington at the time, and he said, we understand that General Eberhart is the supported SYNC and that you have been appointed the JFAC, the Joint Force Air Component Commander, and we want to roll under your air tasking order. I had Vice Admiral Bucky of the 3rd Fleet, who was steaming the aircraft carrier towards the West Coast to do the same thing. So the system in terms of military cooperation worked tremendously well. I would also hasten to say that during the course of time as we were on orbit and that our resources were extremely limited in many cases because we initially could not see even what the FAA could see, we used our very strained AWACS aircraft, our warning aircraft that are used all over the world. And Brigadier General Ben Robinson was stretched very thin, but he continued to do what he could. The United States Customs provided us with E3s with radars that gave us coverage in other parts of the area. And as General McKinley alluded to, we were able to bring in units, Air National Guard and active duty theater air control units that are designed to be deployed, and integrate them into our air picture, not only for air, but also for voice. So we did a lot of things early on, but the things that were missing, in particular, immediately were, number one, we couldn't see into the interior of the country. We couldn't talk to our aircraft that were airborne to the interior of the country, and we did not have a command and control system that would absorb the number of radars. And we were able to do that very rapidly. That coupled with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and with the Northern Command has provided defense in depth to, in my opinion, to protect this country in a way that it has never been defended before. It's in depth at the present time. So we need to continue down those avenues. I'm sure there are ways to improve it. I'm sure General McKinley will find those ways. General Eberhart is engaged in that as well. But I feel comfortable that we have done those things that we ought to have done in order to provide security before a certain hijacking would occur. And of course, God forbid, if that were to occur again, we are now positioned to be able to see, to be able to talk, to be able to provide command and control, and we have exercised repeatedly our capability to pass an order, a military order, down to the pilot in the airplane or the soldier next to his air defense artillery.
Thank you very much.